All right, listeners, welcome back for another deep dive.
Deep dive.
You got it.
Love it.
So this time, we're going to be tackling a topic that I think we all find pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
It's one that's got a lot of gray areas and a lot to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about heroes and villains.
Yes.
But more specifically, where that line blurs.
Absolutely.
Between those two.
It's a fun one to think about, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because we all think we know good and bad.
Right.
But it's never that simple, is it?
It never is, and especially not when we are talking about fictional characters, because they can really embody both in the same time.
Totally.
So to help us kind of parse all of this out, all these nuanced ideas, we are turning, once again, to the world of academia.
Always fun to bring in a little academia.
Right. Got to have those sources.
So yeah, like you were saying, the paper really digs into this idea that the line between hero and villain, it's not some kind of fixed boundary.
Right.
It's fluid, it's dynamic, it's constantly being shaped and reshaped by individual choices, specific situations, and maybe the biggest one, power, and how it's used.
And that's what makes this so interesting to me, because it's not so cut and dry.
It's messy. Real life is messy.
Exactly. And we love exploring that mess here on the Deep Dive.
We do. So to kind of kick things off, the paper actually uses that awesome line from The Dark Knight.
Oh, I love The Dark Knight.
Who doesn't, right? It's such a good film. But the line, the one I'm thinking of, it's, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not just a cool line. It gets at something really profound about, I think, the human condition.
Absolutely. That's actually a very chilling thought if you think about it for too long.
It is.
Yeah.
Because it suggests that even with the best of intentions,
right,
things can go very, very wrong very quickly, especially if you stick around long enough.
It really makes you wonder if that's an inevitability for everyone.
Right. Like, how many heroes become villains just by virtue of sticking around?
If you live long enough, you're bound to make a mistake or two.
Or 100.
Yeah.
But I think what the paper wants us to consider is, what if it's more than just mistakes? What if it's something baked into the very nature of power itself?
Okay, so how does this paper approach that idea? Like, how do they want us to view this whole hero-villain thing differently?
Well, they use these really fascinating case studies.
Oh, yeah, I love a good case study.
Who doesn't? It's like a story, but with, academic rigor.
Exactly.
So they take these characters we know, we love to hate, from pop culture.
Okay.
And they use them to show how these complex dynamics actually play out in narrative.
Okay, so who do they start with? Give me an example.
They start with Magneto, which I thought was a really smart choice.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because on the surface, he's your classic villain.
Right, bad guy trying to, take over the world.
Exactly. But when you look closer, when you really dig into his backstory, you see how his experiences, especially as a Holocaust survivor, have totally shaped his worldview.
Right.
Like, he wants a better world for mutants, just like Professor X.
Right.
But his methods are just, they're way different.
A little extreme.
To say the least.
Yeah.
But he's a powerful reminder of how good intentions, especially when they're fueled by past trauma, can have terrifying consequences.
Yeah, it's that whole the road to hell is paved with good intentions thing, right?
Exactly. But with Magneto, it's almost like he's on that road on purpose. Like, he knows it's a dangerous path, but he's willing to take it to protect his people.
So does that make you sympathize with him? Even a little?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? And it's a tough one, because understanding his past, it helps us grasp the why behind his actions, even if we don't agree with them at all.
Right, right.
It forces us to confront this uncomfortable idea. Can someone who commits acts of terror still be considered sympathetic?
It's a lot to process, for sure. And it makes you wonder how many other characters out there make us feel this kind of conflicted sympathy.
Oh, it's more common than you might think. And actually, that's a perfect segue into our next example.
Okay, hit me.
Let's talk about Walter White from Breaking Bad.
Oh, good one.
Right. So he starts as this average guy, a high school chemistry teacher.
Just trying to make a living.
Exactly. And then he gets hit with this horrible cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, talk about bad news.
The worst.
Yeah.
So at this point, pretty sympathetic.
Oh, totally. I mean, you'd do almost anything to make sure your family was taken care of.
Exactly. And that's what leads him to start cooking meth.
Yeah.
He's desperate.
Trying to make a quick buck while he still can.
Right. Provide for his family before it's too late. But here's where things get interesting. What starts as this understandable, even relatable desire to protect his family, it slowly transforms him
Into Heisenberg,
the ruthless drug lord.
It's a hell of a transformation.
It really is. And this is where the paper talks about the slippery slope of power.
Okay.
At first, his actions are understandable, maybe even noble in a twisted kind of way.
You're rooting for him in the beginning, almost.
Right, exactly. You're like, stick it to the man, Walter.
You'll cook that meth.
Right. But as he gets more and more power, more wealth, his initial intentions, they get kind of lost.
Distorted.
Yeah, distorted, twisted, corrupted, you name it.
Okay, so at the beginning, we're with Walter. We get it. We're rooting for him.
Right.
But at what point do we start to see him cross that line? Is there a specific moment, or is it more gradual?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one we'll be unpacking more after the break.
Stay tuned, because we are just getting started on the deep dive. It's interesting you mention it being gradual, because I feel like everyone watching this show is going to have a different point where they're like, okay, Walter's gone too far now.
Oh, totally. Everyone's bringing their own baggage to the viewing experience, right? Their own values, their own experiences, and that shapes how they see these characters and their choices.
Totally.
And speaking of characters with, shall we say, complicated moral compasses,
Okay.
The paper also dives into Rorschach from Watchmen.
Oh, Rorschach. Yeah, he makes you think, that's for sure.
He does, and he's a great example of what the paper calls uncompromising justice.
Okay.
So you got this guy, this vigilante fighting crime, which on the surface sounds pretty heroic.
Yeah, classic good guy, right?
Right. But then you look at his methods.
Yeah.
And they are
brutal. Like, where do you even start with that guy? I feel like you could do an entire deep dive on Rorschach alone.
Oh, easily.
Oh.
There's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
But for our purposes for this paper, it's really about that rigid sense of right and wrong he has.
Like no gray area with him?
Zero. It's black and white, good and evil, and he is the ultimate arbiter of that, at least in his own mind.
Which is kind of scary when you think about it.
It is. Because he truly believes he's doing the right thing.
Right.
Even when it means inflicting pain, even when it means hurting innocent people to get to the greater good.
It's like he's almost judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one.
Exactly. And it forces us to ask these tough questions.
Mm.
Can a hero go too far?
Is there a point where it's just too much?
Exactly. At what point do the ends no longer justify the means?
Right.
And that's what I think makes Rorschach so fascinating. He's this unrelenting force, driven by his principles, no matter the cost.
He makes you think. That's for sure. He makes you think.
It really does. Okay, so we've talked about trauma shaping a villain's journey. We've talked about the seductive nature of power.
And we've talked about unyielding justice.
Exactly. Now, are you ready for another example?
Hit me. Let's keep going.
Okay, so the paper also spends some time with Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones.
Oh, Daenerys.
She is, I think, the perfect example of how someone who starts with a genuine desire to make the world a better place can still become corrupted by power.
Yeah, because she starts out, she's freeing slaves.
Right.
She's fighting against injustice. You're rooting for her. In the early seasons, everyone was Team Daenerys.
Exactly. And the paper makes a point of saying that she never loses sight of those ideals, those core values of justice and equality.
Right. She still wants to break the wheel.
Exactly. But it's her methods that change.
Yeah, the fire comes out.
It does. It slowly creeps in.
Yeah.
This willingness to use violence, to embrace her family's fiery legacy.
Mm-hmm. Fire and blood.
Right. Exactly. To achieve her goals.
Right.
And somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, she transforms into the very thing she was fighting against.
A tyrant.
Exactly.
Which is heartbreaking to watch because you want her to be different.
You do. You're pulling for her the whole time, even as she's burning King's Landing to the ground.
You're like, no, Daenerys, don't do it. Don't become that.
Right. But it's a testament to how seductive power can be.
Right. It gets to everyone.
It does. And how easy it is to justify your actions, even the most horrific ones, when you believe your cause is just.
Yeah, when you think you're on the right side of history.
Exactly. And that's a slippery slope that can lead even the most well-intentioned leader down a very dark path.
It's a cautionary tale for sure.
It really is. Okay, so we've got Magneto, Walter White, Rorschach, and Daenerys.
A rogues gallery of morally ambiguous characters.
Right. And each of them showing us a different facet of this blurred line between hero and villain.
Okay, so what other fascinating cases are we diving into today?
Well, this is where things get really meta, because the paper wants us to think about Light Yagami from Death Note.
Oh, Death Note. Okay, so for the uninitiated, because I know we've got a lot of listeners who may or may not have ventured into the world of anime.
Of course.
Can you give us a little rundown of what that story is about?
Absolutely. So Light Yagami, he's your typical brilliant high school student.
So already we're suspending some disbelief.
Yeah,
right?
of course, it's fiction. But the point is, he's this otherwise normal kid who stumbles across this mysterious notebook. And as you might guess, it's not just any notebook.
Right.
It's the Death Note.
The Death Note.
And if you write someone's name in this book,
Yeah.
while picturing their face, they die,
It's like a supernatural hit list.
basically.
Yeah.
So already we're in morally ambiguous territory.
Yeah, for sure.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Light decides to use the Death Note to kill criminals.
Oh, boy.
Right.
The best of intentions.
He believes he's making the world a better, safer place by eliminating evil.
Okay.
He sees himself as a hero, a bringer of justice.
Right. But who gets to decide who's evil, right?
Exactly. That's the million-dollar question, and that's what the paper really wants us to grapple with.
Right.
Because as you can imagine, things escalate pretty quickly.
Well, yeah, a notebook that can kill anyone. That would go to anybody's head.
Right. And that's exactly what happens to Light.
Yeah.
He becomes consumed by this mission, this crusade, and his sense of justice, it gets a little warped along the way.
A little.
Okay, maybe more than a little.
Yeah.
He starts targeting anyone who opposes him, anyone he sees as a threat to his perfect world.
So it's not about justice anymore. It's about power.
Exactly. He becomes judge, jury, and executioner, all thanks to this notebook.
So we go from relatable high school student to megalomaniac with a god complex.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it's terrifying, but it's also a reflection of our own potential for darkness, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's like looking into a dark mirror. I mean, if you found that notebook,
Right.
would you be able to resist the temptation?
It's a question that goes straight to the core of our own morality, isn't it?
It is. And it's what makes these stories, these blurred lines, so compelling.
Absolutely. Because they force us to ask ourselves, what would we do?
Right. Would we be the hero or would we become the villain? Okay, so far on this deep dive into heroes and villains and all the gray areas in between, we've covered some fascinating ground.
We really have.
We talked about trauma shaping a villain's journey.
Right, like with Magneto.
Exactly. We talked about how even with the best intentions, someone can get seduced by power.
Walter White, classic example.
Totally. And of course, we had to touch on the dangers of unwavering justice, right?
Rorschach always makes you think.
Oh, for sure. And then Daenerys.
Yes.
She shows us how easy it is to lose your way, even when you start with the heart of gold.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Exactly. And with Light Yagami, well,
Things got meta.
they did. But there's one more character I want to make sure we talk about.
Oh, absolutely. This one's a doozy.
It is. And it brings us to Wakanda, to the complicated legacy of Eric Killmonger.
From Black Panther.
Exactly. Now, he's a really interesting case because unlike some of the others we've discussed, his anger, his resentment towards Wakanda, it's rooted in this very real history of oppression.
Generational trauma.
Exactly. The paper highlighted how he saw firsthand the suffering of people of African descent all over the world, while his own people, with their advanced technology, their resources, remained hidden.
Safe, protected, but also complicit in a way.
Right. And that's what makes Killmonger such a tragic figure in a way.
Totally.
He's a product of the very systems he's trying to destroy
He wants Wakanda to take responsibility for its place in the world.
and to use its power to help those who need it most.
Which, depending on your perspective, is not necessarily a bad goal.
Right. It's like, I get it.
Right. You can empathize with where he's coming from.
Totally. So in his mind, he's not the villain.
He's the hero.
Right. He's righting historical wrongs.
Even if his methods are, well,
Extreme.
to put it mildly.
Yeah, it's that whole hurt people thing.
Exactly. Killmonger, he becomes so consumed by his own pain, his anger.
That he ends up perpetuating the cycle of violence instead of breaking it.
And that's the tragedy of his character.
It is, but it makes you think, what does true justice look like?
Right.
Can we ever really heal the wounds of the past?
Such big questions, and ones that I don't think we can answer in just one episode.
No, but that's the beauty of it, right? We're not here to give you all the answers.
We're just here to ask the interesting questions.
Exactly. And to dig into these complex characters, these stories, these blurred lines, and see what they tell us about ourselves, about the world we live in.
Because at the end of the day, that's what makes these stories so powerful.
They hold a mirror up to humanity.
And sometimes what we see staring back at us, it's not always pretty.
No, it's not, but it's real.
And it's important.
Absolutely. I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But hey, that's the point, right? To leave you thinking, to spark a conversation.
And hopefully inspire you to dive a little deeper on your own.
You got it. This has been The Deep Dive, and as always, thanks for listening.